Hello and welcome into another episode of Lockdown Wolves. Today on the show, the big news: Michael Bloomberg, former NYC mayor, billionaire, joins the Marc Lore-Alex Rodriguez ownership group. We'll talk about the impact, if there's any impact this summer, and then what impact that could have here moving forward. Plus, we will look at player reviews for Leonard Miller and TJ Warren. Could Leonard Miller have a crack at the Kyle Anderson SloMo role in the rotation next season? We'll talk about it all on the show today. Welcome in. You are Lockdown Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code, all lowercase, LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. And, of course, big news that broke Thursday regarding the Timberwolves ownership group and kind of this ongoing, it is an ongoing saga that we've now had for the last couple of years, and especially the last 2.5 months or so. But a big break in news related to the overall, tenor of the situation. Like we'll talk about what this means. I want to cover Michael Bloomberg joining the Lore Rodriguez group, if it means anything this summer, what it could potentially mean moving forward, why it matters. We'll talk about all that here on the show today. And then we will do a couple of player reviews. We're going to continue that series. I do want to cover Leonard Miller, of course, last year's top pick, early second-round pick. I want to talk about what he brings to the table, and could he potentially find himself a role on this team? We talked about him a little the other day in light of the roster crunch overall, but I want to spend a little bit more time on him, and then we'll also talk about late season addition TJ Warren. So all that's upcoming here on the show today. A big thank you, first of all, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, you can find this show everywhere, no matter where you listen to podcasts. You can also watch on YouTube. And you can also follow an X at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. A reminder, you can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And like I said, anywhere you listen to podcasts, you can find the show as well. All right, let's go ahead and get into the conversation. And let's start with the Bloomberg stuff. So this, of course, broke on Thursday. It was first reported by Shams Charania and John Krasinski of The Athletic. And the report is that Michael Bloomberg, of course, I believe he's the top, maybe he's the 10th or 12th richest man in the world. I got the ESPN report here. I think they have it listed. Forbes calls him the 12th richest person in the world with an estimated net worth of $106 billion. For some context, Marc Lore is a little over $1 billion, and Glenn Taylor has his net worth is a few billion. So they're all very rich. I mean, A-Rod's a 100 millionaire, if you will. So they're all very rich. But Michael Bloomberg is only surpassed in terms of NBA ownership wealth by Steve Ballmer of the Clippers. So extremely wealthy. Now, of course, Ballmer owns the majority of the Clippers. Bloomberg would just be part of this group that currently only owns 36% of the Timberwolves. So his addition to the group has no bearing on what happens this summer related to arbitration, because the arbitration board is only reviewing the purchase agreement that was allegedly violated in March, according to Glenn Taylor. So remember, Glenn Taylor is, and I will talk about why it does matter here in a second, but I want to start why, the part that doesn't matter. Glenn Taylor claims that Lore Rodriguez missed some different benchmarks, missed checking some boxes back in late March when the final payment was due. Lore Rodriguez said they had the funds, but they didn't breach the contract at all. So the key here is that, so they weren't able to figure it out during mediation back in May. And now there's going to be an arbitration board that meets of 3 people who I believe, if I'm not mistaken, each group picks a person and then mutually agree on a third person. This party, this group of 3 will hear the case. and will, in case, quote unquote, and then will make a decision. And they will decide whether or not Leonard Rodriguez gets their final 20%. Or I think it's about 20%. Or no, it's actually 40%. Get that next 40%, or whether or not Taylor remains in majority control of the team. Currently, Leonard Rodriguez have 36%. It was reported they were supposed to have 40, but remember there were several minority owners, like very small chunks, from tenths of percentages to just a couple of percentage stake in the team. And Glenn Taylor quietly bought all that up, which is kind of a savvy business move, but he quietly bought all that up. So Leonard Rodriguez actually only ended up with 36% after the first 2 rounds. The next round is supposed to get them to 80%. So if it's, I don't know if it's actually 40% to get them to 76 or 44% to get them to 80. So this arbitration board is only ruling on what happened in March. And of course, we don't know the in the weeds, nitty gritty details about, like, was this like, I don't know, an email or a fax or a snail mail letter that missed by a minute or two? Or was it they legit didn't have the funds and couldn't prove they had the funds? Or was it, some misunderstanding or mischaracterization or something that Glenn Taylor probably hurts his case, because he came out publicly and said that, essentially admitted he had seller's remorse after Leonard Rodriguez said he had seller's remorse. And Glenn Taylor admitted that, hey, this team's done a great run and I want to be a part of it, which you understand the sentiment from Glenn's side, but it doesn't mean you get to back out on a business deal. So my hunch is this is what it centered around, was Glenn Taylor having seller's remorse because of obviously the increase in valuation, which he had to have been able to project, because that's been happening for years and years and years now. So everyone knew this asset would appreciate. And then the second piece of it is the team winning. And to the extent that they were at the time the top seed in the West and were for most of the year and ended up going to the conference final. So of course, Glenn Taylor wants to be part of it. And I'm sure he found some little fine print that he had in his purchase agreement that he feels like validates it. And of course, we've seen some reporting that says that, Glenn's got great lawyers and Glenn feels strong in the agreement. So we'll see what the arbitration panel says. But the Bloomberg presence helps after that, because the next step in the process is approved by the NBA Board of Governors, essentially the owners, right? The owners have to approve the sale. And there's a couple other steps in there related to the league has to approve. And so if there were any question, even if, say, the arbitration board ruled in their favor, the league or other owners could look at this and be like, all right, well, still, we're worried about what are you going to do to improve the value of the Wolves and more broadly than in turn the NBA. If you guys are strapped for cash and can barely get to your 80% of the team, like, is this legit? Well, now with Bloomberg, there's no issue with cash flow. Bloomberg's the 12th richest man in the entire world, 12th richest person in the entire world. So there's no concern with cash flow. And any sort of, toes that were stepped on over the public, the rounds that Leonard Rodriguez went on publicly after this all happened in March. Remember, they went on different shows and everything and talked about how Glenn essentially snaked them. Snake is a Kevin Garnett term to describe Glenn Taylor, but I'll use it as a verb here, that he snaked them in this deal. And they didn't say that. That's my word. But summarizing in one word, all of the stuff they said, essentially attacking Glenn's character, etc. And remember, Glenn Taylor was the president of the Board of Governors for years. And so there's probably there are Glenn Taylor fans among the NBA Board of Governors, and the people who would then vote to approve the sale. And the NBA, of course, is going to err on the side of a former owner, generally speaking. I mean, they're going to be fair. But Bloomberg, all that to say, only provides legitimacy and takes away the issues or the potential issue related to cash flow and concern there. There's a couple of other factors, too, down the line. Like, for instance, there's an option to buy the final 20% from Glenn Taylor by, I think it's next March. And I don't know if, like, he has to do it contractually or if that's like, hey, if I want to sell the rest of it, I can. But Bloomberg could help, obviously, with buying that. And then also building a new arena, a privately funded arena down the line. And that's been reported as something that could happen in as little as 6-7 years from now. And the Leonard Rodriguez group has apparently already explored, what this could look like in terms of, real estate and, the actual process of privately funding an arena. There's also the regional sports network question. That's something that was mentioned in a couple of these different reports. The Timberwolves games are currently on Valley Sports North, so are Twins games, but we know that there's issues with the regional sports network model and specifically the Valley's networks and Sinclair, et cetera. So there's a lot of other layers here. And Bloomberg helps with all of it because cash is no longer a problem. And even if his stake is a relatively minor part, and it sounds like it is, that means he could still, even if he owns a relatively small share, he could put up whatever cash he wants to support or front the cash for any of these other endeavors for the Wolves and Lynx, whether it's the privately funded arena or the regional sports network for televising Wolves and Lynx games, and then also the buying up the rest of the team. So it only helps once they're past the arbitration process, but it helps in every possible way once they're past it. So it all still hinges on that, because if they rule in favor of Glenn Taylor, then this group still is stuck at 36%. And what happens next? I mean, like, does that trigger Tim Conley opting out next summer? All groups, all parties involved have said they'll pay the luxury tax if that's what Tim Conley recommends for next year. So there's a lot of layers here, of course, as always. But it's significant if this group, if Lori and A-Rod get past the arbitration process, which will happen at some point this summer, and then the NBA vets, and there's the vote of approval by the Board of Governors. So Bloomberg will help in all of those above areas. Adam Silver essentially said this in his pre-finals press conference as well. So exciting news. It's great stuff. It's a really good thing. But we got to see what happens here in arbitration. So, of course, any other news on that we'll cover here on the show. I do want to get to Leonard Miller, last year's top draft pick, talk about what he looked like as a prospect, what he did this year in the G League, and what a potential Leonard Miller role could look like here moving forward on the Wolves. And then we'll close with a bit of TJ Warren and kind of end of the roster talk. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 5 million members. It's the most fun and exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. You just pick more or less on 2 or more player stats for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. With Prize Picks, you can turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. You can make a Prize Picks lineup in as little as 60 seconds. You just need to pick more or less on 2 to 6 players' stat projections, and you're locked in. If you're looking for promotions, Prize Picks has you covered every week, from lowering select player stat projections on Tuesdays, which increases your chance of getting a win, to getting your entry fees back if you have a losing lineup on Fridays. There's always action on Prize Picks, and June is the perfect time to try something out, as basketball is winding down, of course, with the finals over the next couple of weeks. Make sure to try out esports this month, every Wednesday and Saturday in June. If your lineup doesn't win, you'll get your entry fee back. Choose from Counter-Strike 2, Call of Duty, League of Legends, and more. Download the app today. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, the app is Prize Picks. The code is LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA, for a deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting. Instead, make the switch to Locked On Sports Today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Okay. Let's talk about Leonard Miller. So Leonard Miller, of course, was the Timberwolves' top draft pick last season. He was the 33rd pick overall, the 3rd pick of the 2nd round. The Timberwolves moved up in the draft to acquire him, so he was technically drafted by the Spurs, but he was a draft night acquisition by Minnesota. And we talked a little bit about Miller the other day because it was really, I think it was Tuesday when we kind of did the roster review, the salary cap, the current, status of the salary cap for the Wolves, because Kyle Anderson is going to be a free agent. And I think the role, not necessarily the same game that Kyle Anderson plays, Leonard Miller is the closest fit of anybody that's on the current roster to being able to do what Kyle Anderson did. And certainly Josh Minott, if you're just looking for a guy that's like a 4 that can play the 3, or a 3 that can play the 4, Josh Minott is that guy with a little more experience. But the skill set for Josh Minott is different than a Kyle Anderson or Leonard Miller skill set. And we talked about Josh Minott on Thursday's show. And one of my favorite topics, if you listen to the show for a while, I could go a whole show on what I'm excited about with Josh Minott, but I did about 10 minutes on him Thursday and everything he brings to the table. And certainly he may get a crack at a rotation spot. But Leonard Miller's skill set is most closely in line with Kyle Anderson's. Now, the athleticism is, of course, it's a clear advantage for Leonard Miller over SloMo. There's no question about that. And there are some differences. I'm not saying they're the same. I'm just saying who's on the roster currently. Talk about, Kyle Anderson being 6'9" with what, a 7-ish foot wingspan. Leonard Miller 6'10" with a 7'2" wingspan. And he handles the basketball in the open floor. Could play, he's played some point forward in the G League. Remember, he played it in the G League Elite is where the Wolves drafted him from a couple of years ago, or I guess it would have just been last year. G League Elite, G League Ignite. He played for the Ignite, right? I'm pretty sure. Yeah, the Ignite. I don't know why I said Elite. He played for the G League Ignite a couple of years ago, and that's where the Wolves drafted him. And the skill set, and we'll talk about that first, and then we'll talk a little about the numbers and how potentially they translate. The things that stand out to me about Leonard Miller are size and activity. And then also the high skill level for some high level of ball skills, to borrow a football term, of somebody who is as big and, relatively athletic as Leonard Miller is. Again, 6'10", 7'2" wingspan. So slightly bigger than, say, Jared Vanderbilt. That was one of my kind of loose comps last year. I like to use recent Timberwolves comps. And there are some similarities there too. In some ways, actually, he's kind of a cross between Jared Vanderbilt and Kyle Anderson, which is a weird, those two are not too similar. Those two players are not super similar. Size-wise, they are. And so he fits right there. He's fluid with the ball in his hands. He's got a great handle. He's a good passer. He's very comfortable running, like I said earlier, point forward, as Kyle Anderson does. And Vanderbilt was always pretty good with the ball in his hands and didn't really get the chance to do that much at the NBA level, but that was the thing for him at Kentucky, was he could handle the ball and pass it a little bit. Because he couldn't shoot the ball and he wasn't great trying to get to the basket from the perimeter. It's not like he handled in pick and roll in the NBA, or currently handles in pick and roll in the NBA. He was just a high motor guy with size that also had some ball skills. Leonard Miller actually has some offensive game as well. And I mentioned earlier his activity. I think he's effective on the defensive glass. I think overall there's areas, and we'll get into the numbers again, like last year, his rebounding was down at the G League level compared to where it had been before he was drafted into the NBA. But he can do multiple things. Like, he can run offense and well, we'll get into the actual role in a second. He can run offense. He can play in the dunker spot. He can be a cutter from the perimeter. He's a good shooter from the perimeter as well. There's certainly room for improvement there. But because he can shoot the three, teams have to respect it to some extent, at least more than Kyle Anderson. I think some of the weaknesses are areas where Kyle Anderson actually does have some strengths. And this is where the upside of Leonard Miller can get him to where Kyle Anderson is, but he may not be currently. And that leads into, will the Wolves trust him as part of the rotation early on next year, or are they going to try and fill the SloMo role in a different way? Leonard Miller has defensive lapses. He has some sloppy closeouts defensively, and you can see that if you watch his G League tape, either from this year or with the G League Ignite a couple of years ago or a year and a half ago. So where's Kyle Anderson solid? Well, he's solid pretty much everywhere except for perimeter shooting. And he's a solid defender that can guard most positions, and he's good in pick and roll on both ends of the floor. And he's a very good team defender. And that's my biggest concern with Leonard Miller. I think he does everything else pretty well and gives you far more offensive upside than Kyle Anderson. But he's, of course, raw because of his age and experience. And you worry about the defensive lapses if he's supposed to be defending in concert with the rest of the team. If he's supposed to be, part of this team concept and having a solid closeout in the perimeter. If he has to end up guarding the point of attack because of, whatever the Wolves are asking him to do, Kyle Anderson is going to be better in all those areas. And obviously more solid on offense too because of the experience level thing. But there's so much upside to Leonard Miller. He's greater on the rim. He's got offensive touch. He's got he's natural. He's a natural scorer. Kyle Anderson is naturally crafty and clearly comfortable with the ball in his hands and comfortable in his own skin for who he is as a player. But Leonard Miller seems to just have this level of natural skill and feel as a scorer that Kyle Anderson doesn't have. It's not the same. He's just obviously more fluid. and obviously more athletic, and all that, plays into the upside factor. We talked already about the defensive lapses, some sloppy, play defensively, inconsistency, I'd call it, for Leonard Miller. But he is a good defensive rebounder. He's got to work on consistency there too. He's got to work on building his body up. And I can't compare necessarily what he looks like now versus a year ago when he was drafted out of G League Ignite by the Wolves. If he's put on, with an NBA level and G League strength and conditioning coaches and weightlifting programs, if he's put on muscle, he's put on weight, but that's something that he needs to do in order to rebound consistently at the pro level. Stat-wise last year, I mentioned already the some of the offensive stuff is good or is as good or better last year as it had been with G League Ignite. Like in the regular season in the G League, he upped his points per game, and leaving the shooting, relatively similar. The three-point shooting actually went up to 38% from outside the arc. He was only 33% with G League Ignite, which is great to see. And then rebound-wise, the rebound rate was down a little bit on both ends of the floor, but we saw the assist rate go way up, and the turnover rate went up, but not nearly as much as the assist rate or the usage rate. He had the ball in his hands a lot more last season than he did with G League Ignite. I mean, with G League Ignite, look at the guys he was playing with, right? Scoot Henderson, et cetera, guys like that with the G League Ignite. Whereas with Iowa, he was kind of the focal point. In the Showcase Cup, which is 12 games versus 20 games of the regular season, some of the numbers were better, some of them were worse. It's a smaller sample. He didn't turn it over as much. He also didn't assist as much. The rebound was actually worse, but the scoring was better. He had an effective field goal percentage of 59% in the Showcase Cup play, which is a dozen games. He shot more than a third of his shots from outside the arc, and the three-point percentage was a little worse. It was only 33%. But across the board, he shot the three better last year than he did the year prior, and he assisted better than he did the year prior. And I think everything except the rebounding numbers, to me, looked better last year than what he did with G League Ignite the year prior. And again, we're talking about a guy who doesn't turn 21 until the week of Thanksgiving. So he's still 20 years old. And he only ended up playing in 17 games at the NBA level, all garbage time minutes in the NBA. And, for what it's worth, which isn't much, he was 2 of 5 on three-pointers at the NBA level and looked good, looked comfortable as an NBA player in garbage time over, 52 minutes over the course of 17 games in the regular season. So there's a lot to like about Leonard Miller. I don't think the Wolves are going to hand him Kyle Anderson's job, as I said before. But actually, let's do this. Let me summarize what I think happens with Leonard Miller next and where I see him fitting in, and then we'll close with TJ Warren. So we'll do all that here next. All right, so Leonard Miller, I don't think the Timberwolves hand Leonard Miller a job next year as, hey, you're SloMo, you're a ninth guy. I just don't think that's likely. He's going to be 20 years old when the season starts. This team went to the conference finals. It goes back to the conversation we've had a couple times this week, is what's the offseason path? There's no cap space. We know that. The Wolves are going to pay a tax penalty next year for being over the second apron, almost for sure. I think it's very unlikely they bring back Kyle Anderson because someone's going to give him more than the mid-level exception, which is the max the Wolves will be able to offer anyone this offseason. And so on some level, the Wolves will have to do something like what Denver did when they let Jeff Green go and they let Bruce Brown go and they backfilled with young players, Zeke Naji, or even rookies like Julian Strawther, Peyton Watson. Of course, Christian Brown was already part of the rotation, but expanding his role. So those guys all stepping into roles that, taking DeAndre Jordan out of the rotation, like making these tweaks, but allowing some of this young talent, this young, affordable talent. And that's the key, is the Timberwolves, you're going to be a consistent contender with the way the CBA is set up now, and you're going to have 3 max players, which the Wolves do with Ant, Cat, and Rudy. You have to hit on second-round picks, and you have to play those guys. And Michael Malone went away from playing those guys over the course of the year last year, and we heard some of the comments he made about playing young guys, and it wasn't his favorite thing. And Chris Finch, most of these coaches don't want to. If you want to contend, you have to have veterans play, but you also have to build up some of these young guys and have them as part of your rotation. So I do think there's a world, and clearly the Nuggets tried this last year, there's a world in which some combination of Leonard Miller, Josh Minott, those are probably the two main ones, are it's not going to be Wendell Moore Jr., I don't think. Those are probably the two guys that have a crack at cracking the rotation, the top 9 or 10 guys. And if they do great, then great. They'll have a role come playoff time. But more likely than not, they're on the fringes of the rotation. They're seen anywhere from a handful to 15, 16, 18 minutes a game early, stepping in if guys are hurt or need rest days. But then come April next year, they get phased out in the same way that Zeke Naji and Peyton Watson, to a lesser extent, and Julian Strawther certainly were phased out for Denver. And I'm using that example because it's the most recent relevant one where they had to do exactly this. And then they pared back the rotation. And of course, they ended up losing in the second round. They also won the title the year before. So it's not quite apples to apples, but there's a lot of similarities. Can the Wolves hit on these guys? Can these guys contribute? Now, I think what's likely to happen is the Wolves will bring in some vet minimum guys with experience, and they'll battle it out in training camp and preseason and early in the regular season and see what shakes out. And then the Wolves will be prepared to play the buyout market like they did this year. TJ Warren wasn't a buyout this year, but they picked him up around that time. He contributed to some regular season games. We'll talk about him in a minute. But maybe there's some higher level contributors like, the Lakers picked up Spencer Dinwiddie, guys like that who maybe could give a little bit more. And Denver didn't end up having success there. But that's part of the strategy. Like, it's a push and a pull. Would you rather trade Naz Reid or Karl-Anthony Towns? Or would you rather play Josh Minott or Leonard Miller for your 9th, 10th, 11th rotation spots or spots on the bench? Pick up some vet minimum guys, and between that and the buyout market, cobble together the end of your rotation because you still have a strong top 7. It's not like they're trying to put together a full bench. You still have Naz Reid and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. Now, after next year, Alexander Walker's a free agent, and then you have to figure that one out too. And that's where, if Wendell Moore Jr. is not a hit, if you didn't hit on that pick, that's going to hurt, right? That's going to make things challenging. If you need to find that 7th rotation spot. But right now, we're only talking about spots 8, 9, 10. One of them is probably a point guard, a Jordan McLaughlin, Monte Morris, or similar player. The other two are the Kyle Anderson type role. So how are they going to fill it? And I think Leonard Miller's got a shot. Clearly, he won't be at the same level as a team defender or as a Swiss Army knife offensively, straw that stirs the drink offensively. But I think the upside is there, and he certainly has the handle to do it. He certainly has the offensive feel and touch to do it. But he's going to be a far kind of the opposite of Kyle Anderson in terms of a strong, savvy vet to a really raw, essentially rookie next year, even though he played in 17 games this year. So pretty interesting to see what shakes out. And of course, we'll see what happens over the course of free agency. And if the Wolves do make a trade, which we'll talk about at some point as a possibility, and also how the draft goes for Minnesota, they do have a first-round pick. So there's lots to keep an eye on here. But Leonard Miller, to me, could be that Kyle Anderson role here down the line. All right, let's close by talking TJ Warren. Not a whole lot to say about him, but I wanted to cover TJ Warren. Of course, he was added, I don't know, what was it? Like right after the deadline. So it was sometime in March when the Wolves had to add somebody to the roster. He hadn't played since last season. He split last year with Phoenix and Brooklyn, and the Wolves brought him in, and he immediately played for this team because of injuries. And pretty much right after they got him, remember Rudy had that knee injury that he suffered on the road in LA, and TJ Warren was like thrust into the rotation. And then he slowly fell out of the rotation at the end of the season. And of course, wasn't in the playoff rotation. So the first game with the Wolves, he played 16 minutes, and then he played 11 the next night. He played 23 minutes in that game at the Lakers. And then, well, actually, his first 5 games, he played double-digit minutes, was in the rotation for the first 7 games on the team, and then he only saw garbage time minutes really the rest of the season. So he was a 5-game rotation player because of, remember at the time, Cat was still out, Rudy had the knee, something happened to Naz as well because Luka Garza was playing heavy minutes, and TJ Warren was just like a major part of this rotation. His game high for the Wolves was 8 in that 48-point win over the Raptors back in early April. In a game that mattered, his game high was 7. He shot the ball. The idea was he could provide a little bit of spacing with size, but he was not a good 3-point shooter for the Wolves. It always looked awkward, like when he was loaded up, almost like not exactly like Kyle Anderson, but similar. He was 2 of 13 outside the arc. Didn't exactly provide the floor stretching ability, and rebounded a little better than what he'd done for his career, but that was never really the role. The idea was he was a 3 that could guard some 4s, kind of plug and play. And he did that. He was fine. He helped the Wolves over the course of those games. I mean, they lost that Lakers game, but in the games in which he was in the rotation, they went 3-2. They lost at Cleveland, and they lost, which actually was the so the first game he played for the Wolves, I forgot this. The first game he played for the Wolves was the Pacers game when Ant got that game-saving block. It was right after the cat injury because the Wolves won in Indiana. Then the next night they played in Cleveland, and that was the Rudy Gobert money sign game. They lost that one. Then they lost in LA, and then Rudy gets hurt. Rudy got hurt, I think, in that game. Then they lost, or they beat the Clippers, won 2 games in Utah. So in 3-2, when TJ Warren was in the rotation. But all that to say, he did his job. If TJ Warren wants to keep playing the NBA, like he's going to be 31 next year, that's going to be what he does. Hopefully for his sake, he signs earlier. Maybe he gets a camp deal with somebody. But he can be the 10th guy, and I'm sure as a vet presence, he's positive, and that's part of the reason they brought him in. He's just so limited offensively, and I think the injuries, remember, he missed a full season, in 21-22, he missed because of a foot injury. Remember, right at the beginning of the year with the Pacers. He came off that career year in 1920. COVID happens. Then he hurts his foot right away for the Pacers in 2021, and that derailed his career. This was only his second year back playing, so he's only played in 53 regular season games since the foot injury over the last 2 years. So maybe there's still some, getting back into game shape or getting the foot right, but he's just going to be limited on both ends of the floor post-injury, and it's too bad for him. But hopefully he latches on with the team next year. It's always possible it's the Wolves on a vet minimum deal at the end of the bench. I just think it's unlikely because – even though that's the role we just talked about, that SloMo-ish type role, TJ Warren can kind of provide that approximation. But I think the Wolves will probably have other priorities. So wish the best for TJ Warren. Hopefully he does latch on somewhere else here quickly. All right, that's all we got for you today here on this Friday. We'll be back, of course, on Monday. Continue the player review. We'll get into guys that were actually in the rotation. We'll talk about Zay Morris. We'll talk Jordan McLaughlin. And I don't know if we'll get to Kyle Anderson Monday or not, but he's kind of next on the list in terms of going up through the roster minutes played least to most. Of course, we'll stay on top of ownership news and any other rumors that are out there. Once we get through this series, we're talking draft, which is now just a couple of weeks away, or within 3 weeks of the draft, I guess. So all that is upcoming here on the show next week. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.